Hello, everyone, and welcome to What Matters, the new podcast from Compassion in Politics, where we'll be talking to a different guest each week about something that really matters. My name is Jennifer Nadel, and this week I'll be talking about race and gender with Pragna Patel. In 1979, Pragna helped found Southall Black Sisters, and since then has been working on the front line, fighting for the advancement of the rights of Black and Asian women. Pragna Patel, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us a bit about what it is that you do?
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to have been invited to do this. I am director at the moment of Southall Black Sisters, which is an organisation that was established in 1979 to meet the needs of Black and minority women. So we've been going now for 40 years. So we've got a lot of experience behind us, and you can see from the colour of my hair that I've been around for a long time now. And really lived...
I'm just talking about her very beautiful silver hair for those who can't see her.
Yes, silver hair. But yes, so we've lived through changing political landscape, you know, and that has really been the backdrop, the kind of economic, social and political changes that we've seen, the highs and the lows. And that, as inevitably, as with any other organization that works for the needs of some of the most vulnerable and marginalized, the political landscape very much shapes our outlook and the work that we do. In 1979, when we set up, it was in the midst of anti-racist activism. Isn't it strange? It feels like déjà vu in a way, given the current situation and the, debates around race and inequality.
Yeah, can you tell us a bit more about what was happening in 79?
We're based in Southall, West London, and 1979 saw one of the, most significant racial uprisings of that period in the country. And the reason it was significant is because Southall, which is a largely South Asian community, largely Indian Punjabi actually, really rose up against the kind of racism that was their daily experience. So sort of the racism on the streets, at the time you had the National Front, which is a far-right Nazi party. You had levels of street racism that was incredibly high. I mean, it was really brutal stuff going on. People's doors swabbed with swastikas, animal feces thrown through the letterbox, burnt, lit rags thrown through the letterbox. It was an era of Paki bashing, which is, white far-right racist thugs out on the streets looking for people of a different colour to beat up. And of course, there was institutional racism, except it wasn't recognized then. This was, pre-Stephen Lawrence. And that manifested in the sort of, in employment, in the workplace, in schools, in the health, access to health services, access to housing, and of course, in immigration nationality laws. So we had a situation in 79 in April, 29th April, I believe, when the National Front marched through Southall in a very provocative manner to hold a Nazi rally at Southall Town Hall. And despite pleas for that meeting and rally not to go ahead, the meeting was allowed, the rally was allowed. And what you saw for the first time was that whole entire community, men and women, young and old, come out to oppose the National Front and what they stood for. And it was a real moment of community unity. And it was basically standing up to racism, and particularly led by young Asian men and women. And that was the first, because we'd seen racial uprisings in other parts of the country around then, particularly involving Afro-Caribbean communities. But this was the first time you saw South Asian communities rise up. And it was against the background of a rise in anti-racist activity across the country. There was Rock Against Racism, there was the Anti-Nazi League, So there was a wider anti-racist movement that was building. What happened on the day was that it was the police came out in full force. And the National Front members were very provocative, and it led to considerable violence and threats of violence. However, what was interesting was that the police were more interested in protecting the National Front members than they were the community. We saw arrests of over 400 young men, all Asian, and they were actually sent, their trials took place in magistrates' courts outside of London to ensure convictions and guilty verdicts. And we also saw the militarized unit of the police, as special patrol groups, as they were called then, out on the streets, and policing of a very aggressive kind that we've seen, that we then later saw in, say, during the miners' strike. And that led to the death of Blair Peach, who was a teacher and an anti-racist activist who'd come to Southall to show solidarity, as did a lot of other white anti-racists, and others. There were a lot of injuries that sustained by Asians and Afro-Caribbean young men who were also part of that anti-racist mobilization. So it's out of that moment, it's a moment that's indelibly edged into the history of Southall, but it was a moment of politicization. It politicized young Asians, and the term Black was then adopted by Asians in the fight against racism. And I think that's a really important point that I want to stress at a time when sometimes people question the use of the term Black, even by Asians. Even Southall Black sisters, even now, we sometimes get asked, sometimes in a quite hostile way, why do you call yourselves Black? And our point is that this is a political term. It signifies struggles against racism and common histories of colonialism. And, and it was borrowed from the kind of civil rights movements in the US, which turned the whole notion of Black on its head, and instead of seeing Black in negative terms, portrayed Black in very positive terms. We're proud to be Black. We are Black, but that doesn't mean we're less. And I think all of that still resonates, particularly now with the Black Lives Matter movement. And that's why I've kind of gone to some lengths to describe this, because of the resonance I think it still has for us, and how ironic and how bizarre it is that 40 years later, we're repeating some of, these same struggles are kind of rumbling on in some ways.
Before we talk too much about the parallels with what's happening today, can you talk us through why Southall Black Sisters? Why women?
Yes. Coming out, so the young women that came out of that anti-racist activism formed Southall Black Sisters. And they were women of Asian, Afro-Caribbean, and other minority backgrounds. And they formed as a feminist campaigning organization. And the reason for doing that was twofold. One, although they were part of the anti-racist movement, as women, their voices were not being heard. The women's question was always sidelined. The bigger struggle is the struggle against racism. Therefore, women's issues take a back seat. So the sexism of the anti-racist movement itself led to the formation of autonomous Black women's groups. So at the same time that Southall Black Sisters formed, you had other Black women beginning to grow in consciousness about what it is to be women and Black. And so you had Brixton Black Women's Group formed. You had, there was Birmingham Black Sisters. There were lots of, Black women forming autonomous groups committed to fighting racism, but also sexism. The other reason for forming Southall Black Sisters was also to tackle gender inequality in the wider society generally. And so that coincided with the kind of rise in feminist consciousness at the time. So there was a burgeoning feminist movement, what's often called the second wave feminist movement, And at that time, there were feminist groups who were forming, raising consciousness about what it is to be women, and making demands of the state around reproductive rights, around, equal pay. All of those things were also taking place. So Southall Black Sisters formed as a secular, anti-racist, feminist organization committed to challenging both racial and gender inequality, because we also, the whole point was that there was no space for Black women. In the anti-racist struggle, there was no there was no space to raise the women's question. In the wider feminist struggles, there was no space to raise the race question. And so Black women felt that there was a need to come together to share experiences of what it meant to be Black and women and working class even in the society around them, and to articulate that experience and start carving out a space and making sure that Black women's voices were also heard. And again, that has resonance now because we have a Black Lives Matter movement, but largely it's focused on Black male experience. So, there are these resonances that are just kind of going on across the decades.
And looking back to that moment when you formed and you had to try and carve out this space, what was the response of the largely white feminist organisations or the largely male-dominated anti-racist movements?
I mean, there was, obviously a little confusion, a little bewilderment going on as far as the white feminist movement is concerned. And I think there was the kind of consciousness raising led to a very painful self-reflection going on because, a lot of women had to challenge their own assumptions about what it is to be women. Is women a homogenous category? How does that intersect with experiences of class or experiences of race or experiences of age or, having a higher education? So that was the challenge to the women's movement, to look at, the fact that, women in different contexts experience things differently. What's now referred to as intersectional analysis, looking at how, different strands of inequality come together to shape experiences of discrimination and marginalization. So that was, so there were very often very painful self-reflections and debates and conversations that were taking place around how to be more inclusive as a feminist movement, how to shape analysis of patriarchy, taking into account racism, socioeconomic status, and all of those things. As far as within the community, there was huge hostility towards us, towards the early, in the early days, there was hostility emanating from two sources. Within the anti-racist movement, which is quite macho, which is quite patriarchal in its own way, although progressive on issues of race and class. And there was considerable sexism that was an obstacle. You didn't see women in positions of leaderships leading the anti-racist struggle. You didn't see the experiences of women reflected in the kind of analysis that was put forward, where women were targeted not just because they're Black, but also because they're women, because they're more vulnerable. There wasn't a gendered analysis of racism that came out. There was kind of sexism as well. The men involved were also men who, sexually harass women. And taking up those issues was also quite painful for Black women to point that out and name and shame those kinds of practices. There was also hostility within the community from so-called community leaders, who were the patriarchs of the community, who were the traditionalists, who were, regarded as community leaders. They're always male, largely religious backgrounds or business backgrounds, no interest in social justice, and yet they were there, elevated by the state, to speak on behalf of the whole community. And of course, they never spoke about women and women's issues. And those early struggles were really finding our place and setting up the Advice Advocacy Center, which we now operate and have operated for the last 40 years or so, was incredibly difficult because in the early days, the hostility was, particularly within the community from the traditionalists, was quite intense. And we were constantly threatened. We were constantly called homebreakers or prostitutes or, Western feminists, because our values of, women's liberation didn't tie with community norms about women being in the home and subservient to men and that kind of thing. So, those kind of labels were thrown at us. And we were seen as, lesbians and homebreakers and all of these things. We were constantly told that, women were coming to us in their droves when we set up the advice center, and mainly because of issues of violence in the home and needing support. And in supporting those women, advising them of their rights, encouraging them to exit abuse and assert their rights, we were often called home breakers, as if we were literally dragging, the portrayal of us was that we were these aggressive women that were literally dragging women out of their homes and telling them to divorce their husbands. And some of that hostility got played out in through local government structures. So, for example, some of these community leaders who also held positions of power in the local council would use that power to try and veto any funding that might be being offered to us. And on one occasion in the late 80s, tried to mobilize the community to have us shut down.
So you were having a personal battle as well as a political battle?
So yes, I mean, in this, I'm not sure what you mean by personal in relation to it within the community.
No, I mean in terms of the accusations that were levelled at you.
Yes. I mean, they were personal battles insofar as they were personal attacks, but they were also a collective attack. They were also political attacks because, they were aimed to discredit the idea that feminism is not Western, it's not Eastern, it's about rights, it's about women's liberation, that's universal. So, these were also political struggles. I would say they're highly political struggles. Personally, we managed to cope with the threats and with the individual instances of hostility towards us. But these were essentially very political struggles about women challenging the political status quo, challenging the cultural and religious status quo that kind of justified violence against women, justified forced marriage, justified honor-based violence, justified inequality as far as women are concerned, and other inequalities, LBGT inequalities. In fact, that was taboo. Sexuality and raising anything around sexual identity was completely taboo, and still remains the case. So these were highly political struggles. They were political struggles in terms of challenging the right of these so-called community leaders to speak for us. These were political struggles challenging local authority not to mediate, not to, constantly deal with communities through these gatekeepers and mediators. And it was a challenge to the wider society to ensure that, women's voices were heard, Black women's voices were heard, particularly because they were really invisible. And it was also a challenge to the anti-racist movement and to the feminist movements. So these were all kind of, forms of questioning of both traditional and more progressive movements, that what they had in common was the kind of inclination and to kind of sideline women altogether.
Looking back now over 40 years and at a time when once again the anti-racist movement is taking to the streets, how much do you think has changed, and what struggles that you were fighting then still remain?
Oh, it's hard, isn't it? We're right in the middle of the, major questioning about what has been achieved around racial equality and why is it that we still got a long way to go. So it sometimes feels, but particularly at a time like this, it does feel as if has much changed, has anything changed? But I don't think it's that pessimistic. I'm not that pessimistic. I think that there have been amazing struggles over the years, the whole mobilization around Stephen Lawrence, the recognition that there is institutional racism, decades after 1979 and other racial uprisings, when people were saying this, and the whole way in which Black men in particular, but also women, were criminalized by the state. All of these things were raised then, and it was finally recognized. There have been struggles against, Black deaths in custody. There have been struggles against immigration laws that have been particularly hostile and continue to be hostile. And, so some things have not changed. I mean, some of those struggles have led to change, and they have led to recognition that racism is unacceptable. And I think we would be hard pressed to find politicians now who would stand there and say racism is, normal, and it's acceptable. I don't think publicly anyone would say that, whatever some of them might think privately. I think the question is trying to really, really get to grips with the ways in which racism is so embedded in the very structures of governance, in the very structures of our laws, and the very structures of state institutions. And that is much harder to shift. So our current struggles at the moment to ensure that the domestic abuse bill includes migrant women I see that as a very important anti-racist struggle, because it is not removed from the very core of what we need to say, which is that if equality means anything, then it means that we've got to remove the barriers and the obstacles that prevent equality from being realized. And the immigration nationality laws and the system of immigration is itself built on quite racist foundations, because it's about keeping out those considered undesirable and developing an immigration control regime that is effectively and quite blatantly and openly described as a hostile environment policy. I mean, it's astonishing that any government could enact policies in the name of creating a hostile environment. You wouldn't imagine it to be so blatantly open. But maybe that's a sign of the time, or was a sign of the times a few years ago, when it was felt that, you could be blatant about this. And it was this kind of, we're not racist, but we do think that, we need this kind of hostile immigration policy to keep out all those people from the EU and elsewhere. The whole Brexit narrative was imbued with a kind of racist narrative, I believe. So there are lots of challenges. The fact that we see at the moment that a lot of people are willing to speak up, white, particularly within the wider society. The fact that companies are having to sack their CEOs for saying the wrong thing on Twitter. The fact that, people are using social media to question these attitudes, to support struggles against racism. I think these are really hopeful moments. The fact that on the demonstrations recently, the Black Lives demonstrations in the UK also involved a lot of young white men and women. Those are really hopeful moments. So it's, and that may not have happened in 1979 or in, 81, but it's happening now. So there is a lot of hope there. There's new generations are constantly raising. They may be the same questions, but they're still raising them, and they're still willing to tackle them. So that is a sign of hope in terms of, how we've moved forward, even though at the same time it feels like we've also moved backwards in some respect, and also entrenched inequalities. And the COVID-19 crisis has also exposed the kind of glaring inequalities that our society has been living with. And so, what would be wonderful is if post the COVID-19 crisis, we kind of create a new normal that's based on, and to come back to the title of your campaign group, compassion in politics, compassion in society, compassion in intimate relationships. We need this because, we really do need to build upon those struggles of the past, which were about, at its heart, they're about equality, they're about freedom, they're about liberation, but at their heart, they're also about being kind and caring. And we've seen glimpses of that during this crisis in all sorts of ways, but it would be really, really, I think, criminal for any of us to not try and ensure that that is what we take through as one of the lessons to learn, post-lockdown, and the rebuilding of the economy and the rebuilding of our laws. I have to say, I'm not sure how, I'm hopeful, but I worry about the fact that we have a government at the moment that's not a very listening government. And that is, a challenge for us going forward.
What particular issues are you most concerned about in terms of that? You mentioned the position of migrant women, for example, earlier. What are your concerns for those groups in the current administration?
I'm really worried about the plight of migrant populations around the world. I think what we're seeing is the ways in which The crisis has meant that the entire burden has fallen on the shoulders of migrant people. In India, what we've seen are millions of migrant people left to fend for themselves because the government has been inept and indifferent to their plight. You know, we've seen images of migrant workers losing their jobs, trying to get home and walking hundreds of kilometers and dying in the process. We've seen children and women dying in the process, starvation. And that's just in India. Here, my organization is working with some of the most vulnerable women who are migrant women who have no recourse to public funds, which means that their condition of stay in the country is dependent on them not accessing any kind of welfare support. So in effect, they lie outside of the welfare safety net. And even during this period of, you know, COVID, the lockdown period, it's really, really, you know, the injustice is so glaring that, you know, they're still not included or counted as the vulnerable people that the government said need support at this moment in time. So that has really galvanized us around the need to do much more to put migrant women and the rights of migrant women and migrant people generally on the map. I think what I mean when I say that we don't really have a listening government and a particularly caring government, despite some of the rhetoric that they kind of feel compelled to, you know, use from time to time, is the fact that more recently, the kind of attempts made to ensure that there is some protection for migrant people has come through legal challenges. So it is as a result of legal challenge that suddenly destitute families, migrant families who had no recourse to public funds, who used to work but can no longer work because of the crisis, found themselves destitute. And, you know, it was a result of a legal challenge brought by the Unity Project that, you know, finally forced the government to provide support and protection for that group of migrants. And it was left to the courts to say that the current situation that they were facing amounted to inhuman and degrading treatment in violation of human rights law. And that's because, you know, they were left out of the safety net. They were left out of the protection that the government said that it would provide to vulnerable people as a result of the crisis. And other measures, for example, extending bereavement payments to NHS staff who were cleaners and porters and, you know, kitchen staff, had to be extended to these people, not just to doctors and other people higher up in their employment ranks in the NHS. The fact that that bereavement payment was then extended to those cleaners and, you know, kitchen staff and porters as a result of a legal challenge. The fact that the NHS surcharge had to be lifted to ensure that migrants had weren't doubly taxed at a time of this crisis in relation to accessing key health at the time of a public health crisis was a result of a legal challenge. So what we've seen at the moment is that this group of people and the struggles that these migrants are waging themselves, you know, in which we are lending our support to, is, I think, the litmus test of this society and this government. And the fact that it continues to exclude and exclude and exclude is a sign of its uncaring, inhumane attitude. We are working very hard with a lot of other women's groups and a lot of other supporters to ensure that migrant women with no recourse to public funds are protected, particularly in the face of abuse when they need to leave a violent relationship and can't, because they can't access welfare services. We want to ensure that those protections are included in the domestic abuse bill. And at the moment, that is our key campaign, to try and ensure that the forthcoming domestic abuse bill, which the government has itself lauded as a landmark bill aimed at protecting all women, and yet at the same time continues to exclude vulnerable migrant women subject to abuse, is what's driving us to ensure that we kind of expose this and try and meet the needs of the most vulnerable, and in the process change the way in which, you know, migrant people are viewed and the way in which they are supported. I mean, what I think is a central paradox of all this is that these migrant people who are being left out of protection are the very people that the government relies on to form the front line in the fight against the pandemic. So this is the irony. And I think the more people understand this, the more I hope that post the crisis, we will never return to the kind of narratives that we did about how there are too many migrant people and how they're taking jobs and how they're draining the health service and the welfare services. These are the very people who are propping these services up. I'm hoping people won't forget that.
For those listeners who haven't yet come across the situation of someone with no recourse to public funds, can you explain the sort of situation that a migrant woman may find herself in if she is in a domestically violent relationship and tries to leave?
So a typical kind of scenario, one that we see daily, is where a woman will arrive at our doors and recount her experiences of abuse, which often involves physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, emotional abuse. She, sort of the kind of common experiences of being treated as a domestic servant in a household by her husband, possibly in-laws, other members of the extended family, husband's extended family, of being her passport, her documents being taken away from her, all her valuables being taken away, of being denied any contact with the outside world, often have no access to phone, cannot speak to her own maternal family, of being constantly threatened with deportation if she dares to report her experiences to anyone outside the family. Those are kind of very, very common experiences that women recount. They usually come to this country as dependents of their spouses and partners. And a part of their condition of stay as dependents is that they have no recourse to public funds. So when women come to us, what they fear most is that if they leave the situation of abuse, will they be deported? And will they be destitute because they have nowhere to go? They cannot access local authority housing because it constitutes public funds. They cannot access most social security benefits because it constitutes public funds. They cannot even access a refuge because refugees rely on rental income and they cannot get housing benefit to pay their rent. And even if they could, they don't have money to survive. So these women really face a stark choice between staying in a situation of abuse and risking their health and that of their children and their lives, or leaving a situation of abuse and facing destitution and deportation. And so for the last 30 years, we have been grappling with this conundrum and grappling with the need to ensure that migrant women are able to leave a marriage or relationship of abuse without fearing destitution and deportation. And through the campaigns that we have waged over the last 30 years, we've managed to get change from the government. Largely it was the government under Blair that we managed to force through some changes in immigration law that created what's called the domestic violence rule and the destitution domestic violence concession. These two reforms in the law effectively mean that if you've come here to the UK as a spouse, so you have a spouse visa, and your marriage breaks down due to domestic violence, and if you can show domestic violence, you can evidence it, then you can remain in the UK. Pending your application to remain in the UK, you can also access funding. That's what the destitution domestic violence concession says. Now, that's great. It's fantastic. It's come after 30 years of struggle. But what it's done is let thousands of women who come here on spousal visas, it's given them the opportunity to leave abuse without fearing for their lives or deportation and destitution. We are campaigning to have that system of protection extended to all other migrant women who often come under other visas, who find themselves in relationships and marriages of abuse. But because they haven't entered a spousal visa, with spousal visas, they can't access the domestic violence rule or the DDVC, the Destitution Domestic Violence Concession. So all we're trying to do with the domestic abuse bill is ask the government, urging the government to extend the domestic violence rule and the DDVC to all migrant women who find themselves in relationships of abuse and violence, either in a marriage or with partners who are subject to them abuse and who need to leave, so that they can get the protections that they deserve, and that will enable them to live a life of security and dignity. And it particularly impacts on children who are also having to face, witness violence, domestic abuse, and that in itself is hugely problematic because it can reinforce cycles of abuse. So all we're trying to do is say to the government, you've got a system, it works well for some women, please extend it to other women. They go through abuse through no fault of their own. When they marry, they usually have invested in that marriage. They regard it as a vital aspect of their identity. When they exit from that marriage, it's through no fault of their own. And if we are talking about eradicating violence against women and girls, and the government lauds itself around the world as one of the pioneers of, action plans and strategies that prevent violence against women and girls and are addressing violence against women and girls, and yet it consistently does not deal with the need for protection of migrant women. I mean, that's the campaign. And what we really would like to see is those who are in positions of influence, who have any contact with those who have power, to help us, to speak out about this, to raise awareness about this, and to really help us to change, to bring about changes in immigration law that protects all women from violence and abuse.
You mentioned some of the successes that you have had over the last 40 years of campaigning. Of course, you and I first met 30 years ago when I was a young reporter and you were working on the case of Kiranjit Ahluwalia, an Asian woman who'd been the victim of domestic violence and had ended up killing her husband. And that also led to some quite positive changes. Can you talk through what emerged from her case and a cluster of others that came at about the same time?
So Kiranjit Ahluwalia's case, the end of 80s and the beginning of the 90s, the case was involved a young Asian woman, wife, who had 2 young children who had gone through 10 years of abuse. She lived in actually Crawley in Sussex. And she killed her husband after 10 years of abuse. She found herself in court, unable to explain her history of abuse. And it wasn't just that she couldn't explain her history of abuse, it was the court was not willing to listen. And she found herself, she was found guilty of the murder of her husband and was sentenced to life imprisonment with a tariff of at least 10 years. That means she had to serve at least 10 years before she would be even considered for parole. So it was a life sentence. We had been alerted to that case by a women's group in Crawley who felt that they wouldn't understand. It was a women's centre. They wouldn't understand properly the kind of complexities involved because of her cultural background and so on, and asked if Southall Black Sisters would be willing to take the case on. And they also, felt that there was an injustice that had been done because, nobody had sort of heard her account of domestic abuse. So we really kind of stumbled upon this in a way. We kind of took up the case because we felt that we had been so far, up until that point, very used to talking about women as victims of domestic abuse. Suddenly we were finding ourselves having to confront the challenge of supporting women who find themselves at the other end, who kill after abuse. So we never dealt with women as perpetrators, if you like, of abuse, not of abuse, of murder as a result of abuse. And so we felt that, like the Women's Centre in Crawley, we felt that there was an injustice. And so we went about trying to support her. By the time we were involved, she was already set for trial. So we didn't have much time or any time actually to influence the legal team working on her case. But after she was convicted, I went to see her in prison. Her immediate thoughts were about her 2 young boys who were still with her mother-in-law, who was also complicit in the abuse that she had suffered. And so her immediate, and rightly so, she was very suspicious of me. Who was I? Who were we? Never heard of SBS. And when we said we can help you, her first thought was, well, if you really want to help me, I want my children back. I want to see my children. So in a way, our first test was to work with family lawyers to try and get her children back. Obviously, she was in prison, but we managed to succeed. We succeeded in getting her children removed from her mother-in-law and were placed with her sister in London. And that meant that then her sister could take her children to see their mother regularly, Kiranjit regularly. So it was only after that that she became confident and trusted us and felt that we weren't there, as part of some kind of jumping on some bandwagon, that we really meant to support her. And so after that, she trusted us, and we took her statement and we kind of went through her entire history of abuse. We found a new legal team for her, and we worked with the legal team to look at ways in which we could appeal her conviction for murder. At the same time, there are 2 other women. You'll remember this, Jennifer. There was Sarah Thornton, and of course there was a woman called Amelia Rossiter, also in prison for killing their husbands after years of abuse. So this then became an opportunity to link up with other campaigns that had been started around those women. And together we although we worked individually on each case, we also worked together in a wider campaign to raise awareness about battered women who kill. Because one of the things that, they confront when they're in court is, why don't you leave? The question, why don't you leave, is never asked of men who kill their wives or girlfriends or partners and are claimed, and in those days claimed that they did so because they were nagged or because the wives had gone off with someone else, what we referred to as the nagging and shagging defense. These men were constantly using these defenses and getting off on manslaughter. And yet here were these women who were getting much harsher sentences, and they were finding themselves in positions where, out of despair, out of depression, out of fear, they would, turn on their abusers, usually when they slept, usually when they were drunk or somehow less able to fight back. And we had to then rise up to the challenge of explaining why women don't leave abusive situations, talking about all the cultural, economic, practical obstacles in their way, legal obstacles in their way. The law was not geared up for supporting women in these situations. As I said, there was inbuilt bias in the law that favored men who killed their wives, but not the other way around. And so we needed the law to reflect the reality of battered women. We looked at America, where these campaigns had started a little earlier, and women were going through courts using defenses like battered women syndrome to try and explain, how they find themselves in situations where they feel trapped and can see no escape. We're wary of the battered women syndrome as a defense, but we did challenge the law on provocation particularly, and the homicide laws around that basically were biased in favor of men. And the law on provocation, for example, said that if you're provoked and into retaliation, that retaliation must be immediate in order to qualify it as a retaliation against provocation. And women were not able to show that because they often killed their husbands while they slept or were drunk or otherwise incapacitated. And that was for real reasons, because if they retaliated immediately, they would be overpowered, physically overpowered often. So we had to try and show that women, it doesn't mean that women are not retaliating immediately, but that there's a kind of a slow burn that builds up, that, and that finally erupts when they can tolerate no more. So in the course of challenging the legal system to understand these kind of realities of battered women, we highlighted the inbuilt discrimination in the law, particularly around the law of provocation, the homicide laws. And through taking Kiranjit's case to the Court of Appeal, we finally won, and her conviction was overturned. And in the course of that, the law of provocation was loosened. And that, together with the campaigns of other women, eventually led to the abolition of the law of provocation, finally, sort of almost a decade later, in recognition of the fact that the law was yet another system of oppression and, a patriarchal system that denied women their rights. And so it was those cases. We never, when we started out, thought that it would become big. We had no idea that it would somehow capture the public's imagination in the way that it did. And it just took us completely by surprise. But the bias, the discrimination that the legal system, exhibited against men and women who kill, one as a result of abuse, as a result of perpetrating abuse, and one as a result of receiving abuse, was so stark, and that it somehow caught the imagination of the public. There were books written about it, as you know. There were plays written about it, poetry, poems, performances, songs, drama. It kind of captured the imagination of the public in so many multiple ways. And that was itself really transformative moment, because it led to kind of awareness raising, and of course led to the change in the law of provocation itself, and improved the system for many women going forward. So that was that was a high point for Southall Black Sisters, if you like, and one that put us on the map, in more ways than one.
And how hopeful are you that this might be a transformative moment right now, with the protests we're seeing both here and in the States and around the world?
I think that it is a transformative process. I think it doesn't move with the speed that we would like it to, the process. What's interesting in the US, for example, is the way in which there are now national conversations about the kind of police force that democratic society should have. That is a huge step forward. What will come out of this, we don't know. But the fact that there are these conversations, the police forces are being disbanded, that there is some kind of dialogue going on with Black people, with communities, as to what a police force should stand for and how it should function. How does a police force look like in a democratic society? Are kind of profound questions. So I think, that process has started, and I really, really hope that, people there, activists, lawyers, everyone take part in that conversation and help to build something different that we could learn from here. I'd like us to have those conversations. I'd like us to see those conversations now taking place. What we have at the moment is, of course, important in terms of dismantling the kind of cultural symbols of racial superiority through the review that was announced by the Mayor of London into, street names after slave owners and statues of slave owners and things. Important as those cultural symbols are, to dismantle those, we need a much more wider, deeper, profound conversation about how racial inequality is embedded in our political, economic, social structures. And what does that mean if we want to look at a more transformative vision of the welfare state, of policing today in the UK? So, I'm hopeful, because there are younger generations. What was heartening in the protests, question whether they should or should not have taken place aside, what's really heartening about them is the fact that many people, I wasn't able to go on them, but many people said they're all under 30. They're all under 30. And that's fantastic. They're not full of old fogies like us, They're all under 30, younger generation who Perhaps, we'll revisit the kind of struggles that we engaged in all those years ago. Perhaps we'll find better solutions than we ever did. But the fact that they are there and they are making their voices heard, that has to be a moment of hope, always. And I always feel that, even if there isn't a kind of a complete outcome, a material outcome that's necessarily visible, I think it's still important. It's still necessary, and maybe it won't be now but much later that people will look back and say, yes, that moment did change things, so I think it's not easy to know where all this goes, but I think it's really, we have to support this. But we also, those of us who sort of been around a bit, it's also our responsibility to take part in those conversations and also to share our own experiences and to pass on the knowledge and what we've learned, the lessons that we've learned, mainly because they shouldn't make the same mistakes, and also because they can build on things that, that's unfinished.
Pragna Patel, thank you so much. And of course, people who want to support your work can go onto your website, Southall Black Sisters, and offer support, donations, and find out more about your incredible work. It's great to have known you over all these years, and thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. It's always a pleasure to sit and talk to you. Thank you.
What Matters is brought to you by the think tank Compassion in Politics. Our podcasts are part of the Real Agenda Network and produced by Kitty Horlick. Next time, Matt Hawkins and I will be talking with Professor Paul Gilbert, OBE, world-famous clinical psychologist and best-selling author of over 20 books on compassionate psychology. He'll be telling us what he thinks about the current political situation. We hope you'll join us then. And we'd love to hear from you, so do get in touch with any comments or questions. You can find us at compassioninpolitics.com. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, please do subscribe and tell your friends about us. We're available on all the main podcast platforms. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to being back with you again soon.